We're going to look today at two schools of ancient Greek originally, although the Romans in both cases continued them on, philosophies. And they're philosophies in the ancient sense in that they weren't just something that was supposed to be the province of academics and intellectuals. This was philosophy for living. This was philosophy that acted as religion does for most religious people, in that it gave you a guide to life. And these two approaches flourished, as you can see, in roughly 4 centuries BC until, until they were revived to a certain extent in the Renaissance. And nowadays, actually, the Stoics are undergoing something of a revival. And there's new Stoicism, has all kinds of advocates that show up on your Instagram feed. But what's interesting about them is that they have each of them has a well-developed theory of how to live. So, in a Mortal Questions class, this is a topic that we want to address. We want to see if there is a right way to conduct yourself. How should you live your life? The Stoics and the Epicureans each have answers to that question. Both of them basically began at essentially the same time. As you can see, Epicurus, born 341 BCE, Zeno of Citium, who is thought of as the earliest Stoic, or at least the earliest Stoic who described himself as such. The name Stoic that we now use in a special sense, but the adjective Stoic refers to somebody who is unmoved by suffering and is just in general kind of expressionless. That comes from a sort of cartoonish interpretation of Stoicism. But the name actually just comes from the word for porch, because it was where the school or where the teaching took place in Athens. The Epicureans set up a school called the Garden, which was outside Athens itself. So in Athens at the time, you had all of these competing schools. The more prominent ones actually were older schools relating to the great philosophers Plato and Aristotle. Plato founded something called the Academy, which is sometimes regarded as the first Western university. And Aristotle had a competing school called the Lyceum because he wasn't appointed head of the academy as was generally expected, largely because of his philosophical differences with Plato. So you had competing sort of schools that attracted people interested in learning about the world and how to live. They were sort of the universities of their day. So the Stoics and the Epicureans basically start at the same time. Now, actually, both of them have a sort of hero that predates them, and that hero is Socrates. So Socrates is sort of the hero to all of these schools. He is this figure, the sort of wise man who philosophizes in the public sphere but never wrote anything down. Actually, the Stoics regard Socrates as perhaps the only example of the Stoic sage, who is somebody who exemplifies exactly the right way to live. Whereas Epicureans as well see a lot to admire in the way that Socrates lived and some of the things that he is said to have said. So both of them sort of have this in common, that they admire the figure of Socrates, and they do have other things in common. Perhaps the main thing that they have in common is that both of them are materialist, or you might say corporealist. That is, they say that everything is made of matter. There is no such thing as immaterial stuff. In this, they very much disagreed with Plato, who, as you know, is responsible for the idea of an immortal soul. Plato had several arguments that we had a soul that was immortal, that predates the existence of our body, and so on. Both the Epicureans and the Stoics rejected this. So they believe in a universe that is entirely physical. When I say physical, it includes things like gases and fire. It includes, as you probably know, the Greeks at the time believed that there were 4 basic elements to matter: earth, air, fire, and water. And the Stoics certainly agreed with this. And they thought that fire had a sort of sacred quality to it. And so Stoics actually believe that we do have a kind of soul, but it is a material soul. It is a soul that is like sort of hot air inside you. Now, the Stoics also believed in God, which you might think is a bit strange given that they are materialists. But they believed that God was a material being. And in fact, they identify God with the universe. Now, Epicurus, while followers of Epicurus much later in history, and Lucretius, actually, who is the other major Epicurean, who was a Roman poet and whose work we have. The trouble with the early writers, Epicurus, the early Greek writers, is that we have very little of their actual work. And we have to work out what they said from later commentators. There's a guy called Diogenes Laertius who gave useful summaries of early philosophers, and that's where we get most of our information about Epicurus. Epicurus in particular was not liked by Christians later. And there's some speculation that most of his apparently voluminous work was destroyed because of his views on God, and that can be easily taken as atheistic. Whereas we do have the complete we have a complete work of Lucretius that is very much influenced by Epicurus, although it has some, we take original arguments. For example, we've already looked at a Lucretian argument about death, the symmetry argument, that is, the time after you die when you don't exist is exactly the same as the time before you're born when you don't exist, and because you don't fear the time before you're born or regard it with horror, you shouldn't regard with horror the time after you die. Okay, so what distinguishes them? Given that they're both material, how are they different? Well, one of the major differences between Epicureanism and Stoicism is, while both of them agree that the universe is material, that there's no immaterial stuff, there is no God separate from the universe. The Stoics believed in an active God. The active God is a bit like the soul of the universe. So God is a physical thing like hot air that is distributed throughout the entire universe, and the more passive matter that the universe is controlled by is like the body of the God that is acted on by the active force of the hot air. So just as we have a soul that is like hot air that controls our more passive, more solid body, so the universe has a soul that is God. And this God has a providential plan. So that is there is a divine plan for the universe, and it is a good one. So the universe is going to evolve in a way that it should. That is the optimal way that it could. Now, the Epicureans, the Stoics, that view of the universe was kind of appealing to later Christian thinkers, because it's a lot like the idea that the Christian God has created the universe and has a plan for it. But don't mistake how materialist the Stoics are. They don't believe that God is a separate being from the universe that created the universe. The universe itself evolves and destroys itself on a regular basis. In fact, they believe they have a kind of phoenix view of the universe. The universe keeps evolving and then burning out in a giant conflagration and then starting up again. And because it evolves according to a divine plan, there's very little possibility of variation. So it's as if the story of time is retold in exactly the same way repeatedly after each of these conflagrations. And they were very much deterministic. That is, Stoics believed that one thing causes another according to this plan. A common term that predates the Stoics and the Epicureans is this idea of logos, which is a very broad word. It's actually the same word that is translated as the word at the beginning of the Bible, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word." This is logos. This is like the idea that the Word is like a plan, is like divine thought or something. But there is only one way that this can transpire. So every event that happens in the history of the universe, including everything that you or I do, is according to a divine plan and could not be otherwise. That is what determinism means. Now, this has implications for free will, as as the Stoics and the Stoics critics, including Epicureans, understood at the time. This seems to imply that we cannot do otherwise than what God has determined we will do, which sounds like we're kind of puppets of fate. And actually, there is an element to that, although Stoics would deny that their view says that we don't have free will. We absolutely are capable of controlling ourselves. And in fact, that's a huge part of Stoic ethics, is self-control. That's one of the four major virtues that Stoics say that we should follow. And actually, these four virtues predate the Stoics too. These are the four that are listed in Plato's Republic, for example, which predates the Stoics. And they were sort of, the virtues were an idea that was generally around in Greek culture long before Plato too. That is, the right kind of life is a virtuous life. And actually a word on virtues. Virtue is an English translation of the Greek word arete, which means excellence. So really, in order to live virtuous is to live the best life, to live the most excellent life, the best version of a human life that you could live, according to the Stoic idea, and actually Plato and Aristotle shared this idea. Stoics say that the universe is this fiery material thing controlled by a sort of God mind that has a plan that is nonetheless material. It has to be material because the Stoics understood the mind-body problem that actually plagued Descartes in the 1600s. when he suggested there were two different kinds of stuff, material and immaterial. As his critics at the time say, how can the immaterial thing affect the material thing? And the Stoics knew this problem, and that's why they didn't believe in an immaterial God, or in God as separate from the material universe. So God, in order to have influence in the universe, has to be a material thing. And the universe unfolds according to this, this plan. What does that mean for human action? Well, before I get to that, and before I get to the Epicurean challenge, because these schools, their views kind of developed as a result of constant debate and basically low-level academic warfare between these schools. You know, each of them had a set of criticisms of the other because they're sort of competing for customers. They want to make it clear that the opponent's product is not workable, so that's why you should go to their schools. So, but at the same time, being exposed to this criticism enables or requires that each of the Stoics, for example, come up with responses to Epicurean criticisms and vice versa. So you see a sort of development of the theories over the course of the existence of their schools. And also this extends into the Romans. There was a moment, I think it was about 80 BCE, don't quote me on that, when Athens sent representatives of its major schools. There's another major school that I'm not talking about, which is the skeptics. They were very influential on both of these camps, but they don't really have as much of a recommendation for an ethical life. They don't really have a well-developed ethics as both of these camps do. So they're less interesting if you're looking at philosophy as a guide for how to live your life, as a sort of self-help manual. So that's why I'm not talking about them. But they sent a representative to Rome. The Stoics sent a representative to Rome. Actually, the Epicureans were not represented because of Epicurus' view that you shouldn't involve yourself in politics. Politics is corrupting and is not conducive to ataraxia, which is the goal of Epicurean life. But nonetheless, because the Greeks sent representatives of these schools, this made a huge impact on the intellectual and public life in Rome at the time. It was like the coming of the Beatles, I guess, to America. And that sort of started up the influence of the Roman versions of both of these. I don't know how Lucretius was exposed to Epicureanism, given that Epicurus didn't the Epicureans didn't send a representative, but he did. Okay, so one of the insistences of the founding Stoics, in particular this guy, Chrysippus, who is apparently the most voluminous writer and considered sort of, I don't know, the true genius of the theory of early Stoicism. They insisted that there are three branches to wisdom that the true Stoic must study. And that these three interacted in an essential way. And they gave kind of analogies to illustrate this, like an analogy of an egg. Like one of them is the yolk that is nourished by the white, and the other one, logic is usually represented as kind of the protection, like the shell of the egg, or another analogy is a garden with a fence around it. But all of them are essential parts of the Stoic life. So you couldn't separate out just ethical guidelines or how to live your everyday life from the logic and the physics. That view was played down by the later Romans, who tended to focus just on the ethics. And that view has persisted into the modern revival of Stoicism. So if you subscribe to the Daily Stoic on Instagram or Twitter or whatever, you won't get theories about the nature of the universe. You won't get theories about logic. You will just get guides about, how to deal with annoying people, as Marcus Aurelius talks about in his meditations. You will just get the ethics. Now, that's not just a view of the Roman Stoics. Apparently, it was a view of a pupil of Zeno's called Aristos. But Chrysippus was very insistent that you have to have all three. And one reason to believe that that's true is if there is one central idea of Stoicism, it is that we should live according to nature. And you can see why if you understand their view of the nature of the universe. That is, the universe is designed in this providential way, so you don't try to buck against it, because that would be like, in Christian terms, disobeying God. So, but in order to live according to nature, you have to understand nature. So you have to do the Stoic physics. Now, each of these terms means something broader than they do now. So logic nowadays just means, like, if you've taken a logic class, you learn about rules of validity, symbolizing sentences and things like that. It's more than that. It's a study of knowledge. It includes what in philosophy is called epistemology. So it's more a sort of a study of reasoning, and physics includes things like theology. It includes the nature of the gods, because, of course, the gods are part of the universe. So all of these are broader than their modern usage. But if you're going to live according to nature, you do have to have an understanding of what nature is. And the views that the Stoics had about the nature of the universe were very influential on how you were supposed to live your life. Which raises the question, can you really separate the ethics from their views? And this is an important question for now, because their views about the nature of the universe are, well, wrong in many respects. Can you really take, for example, their guidelines on how to live your life seriously if their reason for those guidelines depends on their view of the universe? Well, modern Stoics think you can, and Marcus Aurelius, actually, he is perhaps the most famous, in modern terms, Stoic, largely because he was a Roman emperor. He is like the closest we've had in history to a philosopher king, somebody who was determined to live his life according to virtue, kind of the opposite of politicians as we now understand them. And so he is somebody who had the most possible influence of anybody alive, probably at the time. So this is obviously an enormously important figure in Stoicism, and yet at the same time, it isn't even clear that he's committed to the Stoic view of the universe. There's a quote in Meditations where he says, "Well, is the universe providential? Is it the way the Stoics presented it, or is it just atoms moving randomly?" Which is an obvious reference to the Epicurean view. And he says it doesn't really matter for someone who's going to live virtuously. So he thinks that you can separate them. I'm going to pause for a second on the Stoics to give you some of the contrast with Epicurus in his view of the universe. So, again, he's materialist, but he doesn't, he disagrees fundamentally on what a material universe would be like. For one thing, he says the universe is infinite. So the Stoics agreed with Aristotle that the universe is finite, because they didn't think Aristotle thought that if it wasn't finite, then nothing could ever happen. But the Epicureans said, well, and perhaps this is a thought you've had when you were a kid. I remember lying in bed thinking about this. If there's an edge to the universe, then you could go to the edge and you could punch your fist through the edge of it, and then you would have expanded the universe. What's outside the universe if not the universe? The universe is everything that exists. How can that be finite? So they insisted that there was an infinite universe and that there were an infinite number of tiny atoms. Atoms comes from literally the Greek word for uncuttable. A means un, so presumably Tom means cuttable. So in other words, this is different from the view that Aristotle had and the Stoics had, that, you know, you could keep going down. So the odd thing is the Epicureans believed that the universe was infinite, but that you could, the amount that you could divide the universe, it's infinite on a macro scale, but finite on a micro scale. There's only so small you can go, and you can't break things down any further. Whereas the Stoic is sort of the opposite. They think that it's finite on a macro scale, but infinite on a micro scale. You can just keep getting smaller and smaller. And also they thought that there was no such thing as void. If you have atoms, what are they in? Well, they're in this thing called the void, which is emptiness, so that, you know, that's why they can move around and bump into each other, that there's something for them to move around in. Whereas the Stoics believed that the universe was full and that it was like a goldfish moving through water. They were always pushing something out of the way when movement happened. The other difference is that he was not determinist. He believed that there was an element of randomness to the universe, that atoms had this thing called the swerve, where they would move for no reason to the side, just randomly. Now, the advantage of this view, this had advantages for several reasons given his theory. He did think that eventually atoms were compelled to move down, and if they were all eventually moving down, then they'd be moving in parallel and they wouldn't bounce into each other and interact. And he needed atoms to bounce into each other and interact, because Epicurus had a startlingly modern view that is essentially everything that emerges is through just random interaction of molecules. And he had a view that sort of is a precursor to Darwin's view of natural selection, that the reason why we get things that persist is that some objects that arrive by random interaction of atoms are sort of self-sustaining and self-reproducing. That is why we don't just get, just random stuff, just constant soup of atoms bouncing off, and there's no stable objects. But he does believe that if you were to ask what's the reason for anything, there isn't one. There isn't a reason for anything. This is very different from the standard Greek view that essentially is what the Stoics have, that everything happens for a reason, and it's the reason that the reason is given by the Logos or God. According to Epicurus, no, there is no reason. It's just tiny things bouncing off each other in a random way. Now, Epicurus did say that there were gods. There is dispute about whether he said this just so he didn't get into trouble, because after all, Socrates was one of the charges that led to his execution was of corrupting the youth with atheistic ideas. So it was not a wise thing to deny the gods. But he did say the gods sort of exist on the peripheries and do not have any effect on us at all. They don't know that we exist. They don't have any plan for us. They're gloriously happy and indifferent. We should emulate the gods because the gods have achieved ataraxia. I'm going to talk about ataraxia in more detail in a minute. But so Epicurean gods, they might as well not exist as far as we're concerned. Okay, so what is another major contrast between them? Well, the Stoics insist that the only good that there is the virtues, and the only bad that there is the vices. There is no good or bad other than that. Now, this sounds fairly plausible, except when you consider this ignores things like pain and pleasure. Virtues, as we've seen, are justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance, and that the only goal in life is to be virtuous. Someone like the Epicureans could mock this and say, well, if that's what you're doing, if you're just pursuing virtue, you're going to just die, because you're not going to take time to look after yourself. You're not going to eat. You're not going to sleep. If the only good is virtue, this doesn't include things like taking care of yourself. In response to this, the Stoics came up with this idea of indifference. There are things that are neither good or bad, but in the basic moral sense, but there are indifference that have value, which is, things like taking care of yourself, and disvalue, which is suffering. Which sounds like then you have a kind of two-tiered level of value. But they do insist that no amount of the good stuff of indifference is worth any amount of the truly good stuff of virtues. So the essential goal of a Stoic is to be virtuous. Now, how does this accord with their slogan, live according to nature? Well, that's what virtue is going to be. Virtue is excellence, and because nature is ordered by a perfect God, then following what nature dictates is going to be in accord with virtue. Contrast that with Epicurus. Epicurus makes a major break. The Stoics are largely consistent with, say, Aristotle and other great thinkers of the time. They stress virtue. Whereas the Epicureans say, screw virtue, let's look at what the only thing is that is good in itself. The only thing that is an intrinsic good, and they come up with the idea that it is pleasure. Pleasure is the only thing that is good in itself. And this is what is called hedonism, as we know from the lecture on death, where we've come across the Epicurean view on hedonism. So, the Epicureans say that is what you should devote your life to. Now, what the Epicureans and the Stoics have in common, and what makes them both different from kind of modern views of ethics, is that both their views seem kind of self-centered. The Epicureans were the ones who tended to be called selfish, but both of them have this view that what you should pursue is for your own good. Not necessary. So this idea of that you should be a martyr, that you should sacrifice yourself for others, seems to be at best secondary. And this is different from modern views like utilitarianism, which is influenced by Epicureanism in that it's hedonistic, but utilitarianism famously requires of people great self-sacrifice, because the pleasure that you care about is the total amount of pleasure in the world, not just your own. Whereas Epicureans say, no, the pleasure that is important is your own. The advantage of this for Epicureans is that there is no problem of motivation to be moral. This is a problem that many moral theories face, is why should I be moral? Morality if morality requires me to sacrifice myself, what's in it for me? What's going to motivate me to do it? And this, the Epicureans would say, is a major problem for the Stoics. Now, I've said that the Stoics are self-centered in that they are focused, you are doing what is good for you in the sense of being virtuous is making yourself good. However, the Stoics come across as less selfish than the Epicureans because they believe that one of the three Stoic disciplines, action, requires sort of expanding your circle of concern that you are supposed to do to view not first your family, then your friends, and then other people, and then everybody as within your sort of sphere of concern, that you should care about them. Now, the reason for that is just because that is the way to make yourself as good as possible. That is realizing virtue in yourself, but it has the effect of making a Stoic someone who is concerned for the good of all. So it's sort of, you care about others as a means to make yourself good. Well, actually, the Epicureans, again, although they appear more selfish just because I think people look down on the idea of pursuing your own pleasure, whereas they don't tend to look down on the idea of pursuing virtue. But the Epicureans actually are the first. Epicurus was the first person known to come up with a sophisticated social contract theory. This is a theory of justice that really took off. Famously, philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, who was a contemporary of Descartes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Locke, whose social contract theory was a huge influence on the founders of the US. This is an idea that blossomed in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. But Epicurus is the first one to come up with this idea that justice is an artificial construct. It's not something that is natural. It is something that we create, and we create it for our own self-interest. So he said, the reason why you should be good to others. So you're pursuing your own self-pleasure, you're pursuing your own pleasure, but you should be good to others. Why? Because it's in your own interest, and it's in everybody's interest. So we should always be good to others so that they will be good to us. You should be honest to others, because if you don't, you will acquire a reputation for dishonesty, and you will suffer as a result. In Plato's masterpiece, The Republic, in Book 2 of The Republic, there is a discussion of justice. The entire book, The Republic, is about justice. And the question is asked, is justice good in itself because it's a virtue, or is it good because of its effects? It's like it has instrumental value. It's not good in itself. It's not in itself good. It's just good because of the effects it brings about. Or is it both of them? And Plato's answer is that it's both of them. It's good in itself, but it's also will bring about good effects. The other two options are taken by the Stoics and the Epicureans. Epicurus says it's not good in itself, it's just good in its effects. And the Stoics say it's just good in itself. So in other words, you should practice justice even if it ends up terribly for you, which it might often do, but it doesn't matter, according to Stoics, because all that matters is that you are virtuous. Let's do a bit more on Epicurus before we get back to the Stoics. So the goal in Epicurus pleasure is what matters, but he has a kind of sophisticated view of pleasure. That is, Epicureans can be caricatured as people who are swinish or piggy. That is, all they care about is self-satisfying, like, pigs at the trough. All they care about is making themselves happy, eating and lying around in the mud. Pigs seem very hedonistic. That view, that is what an Epicurean life would be like, is a misconception of an Epicurean life, but it's more like another school of thought, the Cynics. The Cynics at the time suggested that you should try everything: sex, drugs, rock and roll, eat fatty foods, party hardy, that kind of thing. That, in fact, was not the Epicurean view. Although pleasure is the only good and pain the only bad. So the Stoics say virtue is the only good, vice the only bad. Epicureans say pain is the only bad and pleasure is the only good. In fact, the best thing to do is to try to avoid pain. Desires, you essentially should achieve pleasures that are of the right kind. That is, there are different kinds of pleasures. There's pleasures that are sort of good in themselves, you might say. Plato and Aristotle talk a lot about this. And Aristotle is of the view that there are certain pleasures that are just good in themselves, and then there are other pleasures that aren't really pleasures. They're just what you get from getting rid of suffering. So, for example, what is the pleasure you get from eating? Earlier thinkers than the Epicureans would say, well, that's kind of a lower level of pleasure because you're just filling a hole, and it's a temporary pleasure. You're going to want to eat again. But actually, the Epicureans say that that's a kind of static pleasure, and this pleasure that is this sense of being full and not needing to eat is actually the best kind of pleasure. That the pleasures that you get from tasting food, from the process of eating, that is actually a lower level of pleasure. That's what they call moving desires or pleasures. And there's also this distinction amongst different kinds of desires that you should focus on. And the ones that are the most important are natural and necessary desires. Those are the ones that should be satisfied. These include things like desires for food and shelter. Satisfying those should be your goal, because that will lead to the good kind of pleasure, the static kind of pleasure. Whereas these other kinds of pleasures, vain pleasures, why do you have a desire for approval, like particularly in the age of social media? Why do you care about what other things? It's because you've been taught that by other people. Human beings are apparently very susceptible to have desires inculcated in them by other people. Why do you want those shoes? Because everybody in your school has those shoes and you feel left out. If you weren't at school, if you weren't listening to those, you wouldn't want those. So that desire is entirely artificial. Those are the vain desires that you should avoid. So these are a danger of social living. The danger of living with other people is that you're going to acquire more of these things, which is part of the reason that Epicureans said that the best life is kind of to separate yourself from society. This is why they didn't engage in politics, because politics led to encouraging these kind of things. If you're in politics, you have a desire for power, you have a desire for popularity. These are the kind of desires that actually are much more likely, they're hard to fill. That's one thing that makes them bad, and they're always temporary. They're always they always lead to a desire for more, like drugs. You know, like if you get hooked on drugs, it's you're never satisfied. You can never achieve the static pleasures. So this is another reason why the Epicurean school, the garden, was outside of Athens. It was a physical manifestation of this idea that you should kind of separate yourself from these vain desires. So the other third kind is natural but unnecessary. Think of somebody who is a coffee or wine snob. Why are they a coffee or wine snob? They have cultivated their taste buds so that now cheap coffee doesn't even taste good to them. They've got to have the good stuff. Well, they're stupid, according to Epicurus. You should be happy with the good stuff, with the cheap stuff, you know, because then it will be easy to satisfy your desires. So because the best kind of pleasure is having your desires satisfied, the best kind of desires to have are the ones that you can't avoid, because you know you are a human physical object. You're going to have these desires anyway, so you might as well, you're going to have to satisfy them. But these others, you don't have to have them. But also these can be satisfied simply by a simple life. So the Epicureans, far from being like the cynics and saying party hardy, try every drug, you know, eat fatty foods, that kind of thing, they say live as simple a life as possible, because that's the way you will achieve ataraxia, which is this state of tranquility where you have static pleasures that are satisfied. So there is a guide on how to live. Focus on the simple pleasures. Enjoy the little things. Enjoy simply satisfied desires. Do not be influenced by other people to want useless shit. Don't do that. Stay away from those kind of influences. Now, the other thing is you should study philosophy. Why should you study philosophy? Because once you understand philosophy, it will get rid of a major source of pain. Remember, pain is the only evil. And according to Epicurus, we have three actual Epicurean texts still remaining, because they are preserved in this work of this guy, Diogenes Laertius. And they're three letters that he wrote summarizing his views. One of them, you might think, well, this is kind of an obscure one, because it's all about kind of atomistic explanations of the weather. And you think, well, why is that? You know, couldn't we have got a better piece of philosophy preserved from Epicurus? But this is actually a very important part of his view, because he said perhaps the major form of suffering that people have that make them unable to achieve ataraxia is psychological or mental suffering as a result of anxieties and worries about these things. So the primary goal of philosophy is to remove these anxieties and therefore make them capable of achieving ataraxia. And these are superstitions, belief that Poseidon is going to come for you, belief that natural phenomena are portents of evil, and worrying about dying. We've already seen his argument that death cannot harm you. And now you know the reason for it. The context is that worrying about death is a major source of suffering that ruins people's lives, because it takes away from the pleasure that they would otherwise have. But if you understand that your fear of death is misguided, that fear should go away. If you understand that the gods don't care about us, don't intervene, and that in fact there are plenty of explanations, materialistic explanations for the phenomena that you take to be evidence for gods, like thunder or whatever, then fear of the gods will go away. Lucretius in particular really stressed how damaging religion was. And this is why the Epicureans were very unpopular. He said, religion is superstition. Religion leads people to do evil things in the name of pleasing the gods. And it leads to people having all of these kind of fears and distresses that ruin their lives. So that's why it's important to be able to explain phenomena that otherwise are explained in terms of the gods. All right, back to the Stoics. Now, the main, where the Epicureans have ataraxia, the Stoics have apatheia. Now, this is related to our word apathy. Now, apathy is a negative word. Now, apathy just means kind of, but it means that it's against passions. And again, that sounds bad. That sounds like the ideal Stoic is, as it says in your readings, like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, the Vulcans, whose goal is to be purely logical and to avoid all emotions. This is a misconception, as is nicely explained in the readings. What you're supposed to do is banish the bad passions, which are pathe. So this is against pathe. Pathe these are the bad passions, and they are based on a misunderstanding. Okay. So remember, the Stoics believe that the universe is deterministic. So in some sense, we don't have much control. What we can control is our attitude. What's going to happen is going to happen. God has decided. And it may be that God has decided that your role in the universe is a shitty one, that you have to be sacrificed for the good of others. It's not for you to question that, because virtue, you've got to live according to nature. Nature and God are one and the same thing. You've got to live according to the plan. If you're just a cog in the machine and you have to suffer, well, too bad. But what you do have control over, this is the dichotomy of control. Epictetus talks about this. Focus on the things you can control. And what you can control is your attitude. So what you can't control is whether or not suffering happens to you. Like Epictetus was lame because he was a slave and he was mistreated by his master. In those days, you could buy your freedom eventually, and he did. But before he did, his leg was damaged. So he constantly walked with a limp. He couldn't control that. What he could control is his attitude to it. So it's basically, Stoicism is adjusting your attitude, because that's what you can control, to the things that you can't control. You can't control pain and pleasure because we are physical things, as both schools agree. But these are the wrong kinds of attitudes. These show mistaken, this is a mistaken view of a mistaken response to the world. So, for example, this includes grief at someone who has died. So this is where you can understand why the Stoics might have got their bad reputation. You're not supposed to grieve someone who dies. Your wife dies, you are not supposed to grieve, because grief is a mistaken response. This is all part of nature. Death is part of nature. You have to accept it. So if you are constantly wearing black and weeping and tearing at your clothes because someone died, that's wrong. You have the wrong response. So you can see how they might have got the reputation of being kind of inhuman monsters. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have feelings. That is, you have a rational desire for virtue, and you can have delight, joy. You can have this delight in the exercise in virtue. So, sort of feeling when you recognize someone truly good, has done something truly good, or you yourself have done something good. Self-satisfaction in living a virtuous life. This is kind of the virtue is its own reward element. That is joy. So you can feel good about yourself if you've done the right thing. That's okay. It's not like you're supposed to banish every feeling. But these are incorrect responses to physical stimuli. So if you break your leg, it's gonna hurt. But you can take the right, if you adopt the right mindset to it, you can downplay the hurt. You can figure, like for example, that airman, actually I don't know if this was in your readings, but I think his name was James Stockton. He was an airman shot down in the Vietnam War, and he was kind of like John McCain, kept and tortured, and repeatedly tortured so that he would betray his fellows. And for some reason, he remembered this book, Epictetus's book, that he'd been forced to read and hadn't enjoyed, but he remembered a lot of the slogans in it. And they enabled him, he said, to last through torture, because he knew that if, in response to the pain that he was enduring, he had betrayed his friends, that would be far worse. To know that you had been bad, that you had violated one of the virtues, would be something unforgivable, something that you couldn't forgive yourself for. Whereas pain or pleasure, you can say that's just part of the universe. This too will pass. I can handle that. And he did. He didn't betray anybody, and he survived even though he had a horribly broken leg from the crash that was never set correctly. So this is like their view, this sort of psychological control aspect is also part of their epistemology. Both Epicurus and the Stoics agree that your senses are the guide to knowledge. And in this, they disagree very much with Plato. Plato was very dismissive of the senses and said that only the immortal soul's contact with the forms is the way to acquire knowledge. Whereas both these guys, with their material universes, and they said their senses are the way to get information. So information, your senses never lie. Mistake comes when you take the wrong attitude towards sensation. So your senses never lie in the sense that you are seeing what you're seeing. But sometimes what you're seeing is not an accurate reflection of what's really there. As, for example, a pencil looks bent when you put it in water. It's an optical illusion. So true knowledge is when you give the right attitude to the right impressions, the right sense impressions. And that requires a choice on your part. So you can be mistaken because you have chosen to be. You've chosen to accept the wrong thing. So notice this idea is very much opposed to the idea that you can believe whatever you want. Like I hear people say, I don't know if souls exist, but it makes people happy, so they should be able to believe in them. Stoics would be absolutely opposed to that idea. If you're assenting to an incorrect impression, that is just wrong. That's not virtuous. Now, one of the downsides of Stoicism is that it's impossible to be perfectly virtuous, and apparently anybody who commits any vice is of an equal level of badness. So consequently, there's perhaps one person, the Stoic sage, of which Socrates is maybe an example, who's good. Everybody else is equally bad, which kind of makes you wonder why you should even bother to try, given that you will almost certainly never reach the level of sage, which is something the Epicureans would say. But the Stoic idea of living according to nature and taking the correct attitude is very appealing, and there's all kinds of very moving versions of this sentiment to be found in both Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius's meditations.